This time that Spanish girl joined me on the ridge. I was sizing up the country. She had beautiful big dark eyes and long lashes, and she was about the prettiest thing I ever did see. Do you mind if I ride with you, Mr. Sackett? I sure don't mind, but what about Don Luis? I don't expect he'd like his granddaughter riding with a Tennessee drifter. He said I could come, but that I must ask your permission. He said you would not let me ride with you if it was not safe. On the hill where we sat, the wind was cool, and there was no dust. The train of wagons and pack horses was a half-mile away to the southeast. The first Spanish I started learning that day from her. Are you going to Santa Fe? No, ma'am. We're going wild cow hunting along the Purgatory. Her name, it turned out, was Drusilla, and her grandmother had been Irish. The vaqueros were not Mexicans, but Basques, and like I figured, they were picked fighting men. There was always a vaquero close by as we rode in case of trouble. After that first time, Drusilla often rode with me, and I noticed the vaqueros were watching their back trail as carefully as they watched out for Indians. Sometimes 5 or 6 of them would take off and ride back along the way we had come. Grandfather thinks we may be followed and attacked. He had been warned. That made me think of what Jonathan Pritz had told Orrin, and not knowing if it mattered or not, I told her to tell Don. It seemed to me that land that had been granted a family long ago belonged to that family, and no latecomer like Pritz had a right to move in and drive them off. The next day she thanked me for her grandfather. Jonathan Pritz had been to Santa Fe before this, and he was working through political means to get their grant revoked, so the land could be thrown open to settlement by anyone. Roundtree was restless. By this time, we should have met up with the Indians. Keep those rides close in, Ty. Do you hear? He rode in silence for a few minutes, and then he said, Folks back east do a sight of talking about the noble red man. Well, he's a mighty fine fighter. I give him that. But ain't no Injun, unless a nez perce, who wouldn't ride a couple 100 miles for a fight. Folks talk about taking land from Injuns. No Injun ever owned any land. No way. He hunted over the country, and he was always fighting other Injuns just for the right to hunt there. I fought Injuns, and I lived with Injuns, and if you walked into an Injun village of your own, Will, they'd feed you and let you be as long as you stayed. That was their way. But the same Injun whose teepee you slept might follow you when you left and murder you. They had the same upbringing a white man has. There was none of this talk of mercy or kindness and such like, which we get from the time we're youngsters. We get it even though most folks don't follow the teaching. An Injun is loyal to nobody but his own tribe, and any stranger is apt to be an enemy. You fight an Injun and whoop him. After that, maybe you can trade with him. He'll deal with a fighting man, but a man who can't protect himself, well, most Injuns have no respect for him. So they just kill him and forget him. Around the fires at night, there was talk and laughter. Orrin sang his old Welsh and Irish ballads for them. And from Pa, he'd picked up some Spanish songs, and when he sang them, he should have heard the Spanish men yell. And from the far hills, the coyotes answered. Old Roundtree would find a spot well back from the flames, and sat there watching the outer darkness and listening. The man who stares into the flames is blind. When he looks into outer darkness, he won't shoot straight. Pod taught us that back in Tennessee. This was Indian country, and you have to figure, understanding Indians, that his whole standing in his tribe comes from how many coups he's counted, which means to strike an enemy, a living enemy, or to be the first one to strike a man who has fallen. They figure that mighty daring because the fallen man might be playing possum. Any Indian who was a good horse thief, he could have the pick of the girls of the tribe, mostly because marriage was on the barter system, and an Indian could have all the wives he could afford to buy, and usually that wasn't more than 2 or 3, and mostly one. Orrin hadn't forgotten that Laura girl. He was upset with me, too, for leading him off again when he was half a mind to tie up with Pritz. He's paying top wages, Orrin said one night. Fighting wages, I said. It could be, Tyrell, Orrin said, no friendly sound to his voice. That you're holding something against Mr. Pritz and Laura, too. Go easy, boy, I told myself. This is dangerous ground. I don't know them, only from what you've said, and he's planning to horn in on land that don't belong to him. Orrin started to speak, but Tom suddenly got up. Time to turn in, he spoke abruptly. Getting up times comes early. And we turned in, both of us, with words we were itching to say that were better unsaid. It rankled, however. That was truth about me having a hold against Pritz and his daughter. That I had. She didn't look right to me, and I've always been suspicious of those two sanctimonious men like Jonathan Pritz. The way he looked down that thin New England nose of his didn't promise any good for those who didn't agree with him. And what I said to Orrin that time, I'd believed. If Pritz had been so much back home, what was he doing out here? We filled our canteens at daybreak with no certain water ahead of us. A hot wind searched the grass. At Mud Creek, there was enough water in the creek bottom for the horses, but when we left it was bone dry. It was 7 miles to the water holes, and if there was no water there, it was a dry day's travel to the Little Arkansas. The sun was hot. Dust lifted from the feet of the horses and mules, and we left a trail of dust in the air. If any Indians were around, they'd not miss us. A man would have to prime himself to spit in country like this, Tom suddenly remarked. How about the country we're heading towards, Cap? Worse. Unless a man knows the land. Only saving thing, there's no travel up that way except for Comanches. What water there is, we'll likely have to ourselves. Every day then, Drusilla was riding with me. And every day I felt myself looking for her sooner than before. And sometimes we only got out for a half an hour, at most an hour. But I got so I welcomed her coming and dreaded her going. Back in the mountains I'd known few girls, and mostly I'd fought shy of them, not figuring to put my neck in any loops I couldn't pull out of. Only I had a feeling I was getting bogged down with Drusilla. She was shy of 16, but Spanish girls marry young and younger, and in the mountains they did also. Me, I had nothing but a dapple horse, a partnership and some mules, and my old Spencer, and a Colt pistol. It didn't count up to much. Meanwhile, I'd been getting to know the vaqueros. I'd never known anybody before who wasn't straight-out American. Back in the hills, we'd held ourselves suspicious of such folks. Riding them with them, I was finding they were good, solid men. Miguel was a slim, wiry man who was the finest rider I ever knew, and maybe a couple of years older than me. He was a handsome man with a quick laugh, and like me, he was always ready to ride far afield. Juan Torres was the boss of the lot, a compact man of 43 or 4, who rarely smiled but was always friendly. Maybe he was the finest rifle shot I ever saw. He had worked for Don Luis Alvarado since he, Torres, was a boy, and he thought of him like he was a god. There was Pete Romero and a slim, tough young devil called Antonio Baca, the only one who didn't have the Basque blood. It seemed to me he thought he was a better man than Torres, and there was something else I figured. It was just my thinking until Cat mentioned it. Did you ever notice how young Baca looks at you when you ride with the senorita? He doesn't seem to like that. I noticed that. You watch yourself, boy. That boy's got a streak of meanness. That was all Cap said, but I took it to mind, stories I'd heard about these Spanish men, to be mighty jealous, although no girl was going to look serious at me when there was men like Orrin and Tom Sunday around. There was no accounting for the notions men get, and it seems to me that most serious trouble between men comes not so much from money, horses, or women, but from notions. A man takes a dislike to another man for no reason at all, but they rub each other wrong, and then something, a horse or a woman or a drink, sets it off, and then they go to shooting or cutting or walloping with sticks. Like Reed Carney, only a notion. It could have got him killed. At the Little Arkansas, we camped where a little branch flowed from a spring in the bluff and ran down to the river. It was a good night. It was good water, maybe a little brackish. After night guard was set, I slipped out of camp with a rifle and a canteen and went down to the Little Arkansas. The dark was coming on, but a man could see. Moving down to the river's edge, there was more sand than water, and I stood listening. A man should trust his senses, and they'll grow sharper from use. I never took it for granted that the country was safe, not only listening and watching as I moved, but testing the air for smells. Out on the prairie, where the air is fresh, a man could smell more than around people, and after a while, he learns to smell an Indian, a white man, a horse, even a bear. Off in the distance, there was heat lightning and a far-off rumble of thunder. Waiting in the silence after the thunder, a stone rattled across the river, and a column of riders emerged from the brush and rode down into the riverbed. There might have been a dozen or even 20, and although I could not make them out, I could see white streaks on their faces that meant they were painted for war. Crossing the stream 60, 70 yards below me, they rode out across the prairie. They would not be moving this late unless there was a camp not far off, and that meant more Indians and a possible source of trouble. When they had gone, I went back to the camp, and I got Roundtree together, and we talked to Taurus and made what plans we could. Daylight came, and on the advice of Taurus, Drusilla reined with the wagons. We moved slowly, trying to keep our dust down. It was dry, the grass was brown, parched and sun-hot, and when we fetched up to Owl Creek and found it bone dry, Little and Big Cow Creeks also dry. This last was 20 miles from our last night's camp, and no sign of water, with another 20 to go before they reached the bend of the Arkansas. "There'll be water," Roundtree said in his rasping voice. "There's always water in the Arkansas." By the time, I wasn't sure if there was any water left in Kansas. We took a breather at Big Cow Creek, and I rinsed out Dapple's mouth with my handkerchief a couple of times. My lips were cracked, and even Dapple seemed to have lost his bounce. That heat and the dry air with no water, it was enough to take the spry out of a camel. Dust lifted from the brown grass. White buffalo bones bleached in the sun. We passed the wrecks of some burned-out wagons and the skull of a horse. In the distance, clouds piled up enormous towers and battlements, building dream castles in the sky. Along the prairie, heat waves danced and rippled in the sun, and far off a mirage lake showed the blue of its stream water to taunt our eyes. And from the top of a low hill, I looked around at miles of brown emptiness with a vast sweep of sky overhead, where the sun seemed to have grown enormously until it swept the sky. And from my canteen, I soaked my handkerchief, and I sponged out the Dapple's mouth again. It was so dry I couldn't spit. And far below the wagons made a thin trail. The hill on which I sat was low, but there was a 4-mile-long slope leading gradually up to it. The horizon was nowhere, for there was only a haze of heat around us. Our horses slogging onward without hope, going because their riders knew no better. The sky was empty, the land was still, and the dust hung on the empty air. It was very hot.